When China put a lockdown on the city of Wuhan in early 2020, some Western media said this is taking people's liberty away, saving people's lives at the cost of sacrificing people's freedom. When China recovered from the COVID and the rest of the world was struggling with the outbreak in later 2020, they criticized China for not containing it early enough. When China continued its strict policies in the past 3 years to minimize the number of people being infected, they accused China of adopting unreasonable, draconian COVID policies against its people, jeopardizing the global economic chains. And it seems that they really wanted China to abandon its COVID policies. And now, when China is actually finally gradually easing all its COVID restrictions since the virus is not deadly anymore, they suddenly worry that China has no plans to deal with this outbreak, worry a surging number of Chinese will die from this. Did you see what they're doing? No matter what policies China adopted, no matter what China does, they will criticize it and villainize it. They pretend that they care about the lives and freedom of people in China, but they don't. They just want to see China's policies fail and see Chinese people suffer. So some Chinese people may create some uproars and eventually lead to the collapse of China's government to prove some Westerners' theories that CCP is evil or China's governance doesn't work. As someone who lived through these COVID policies in China in the past 3 years, we will discuss the real COVID situations in China and help you to understand the policies correctly. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Talk It Out with me, Jingjing. This show aims to show you the different voices and stories that are often neglected by some Western mainstream media. And this episode, I invited my friend, Tings Chak, to this show to join the discussion with me. She is the researcher with the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. And Tings, welcome to the show. And how about you tell us more about yourself?
Thank you, Jingjing. It's a pleasure to be on your show and finally get to have this conversation. I think it's an interesting moment for us to actually get to reflect on the last 3 years. I think we've both had pretty intense experiences and lived through many of the, let's say, the shades of COVID. And so I think this is a good conversation for us to have. And actually, as we're both recovering from COVID, so this is also,
Yes.
I think, got it right around the same time. So all of this is aligning quite well. I moved back to China. I'm originally from Hong Kong, but grew up in Canada and lived in different countries. But I came to mainland China in March of 2020. So when you were talking about that Wuhan lockdown, I just came at the very kind of end of that lockdown, just a few days before the country closed the borders. So it was really that, that transitional moment and lived through the Shanghai lockdown for the entirety of that over 2 months. Moved now here to Beijing when we both now experiencing the easing, the soft landing and transition. So I'm looking forward to seeing what we come up with in the next hour. Thinking about the last 3 years, the vast majority of the time, and unlike what the Western mainstream media says, we lived a pretty normal life. I think most of us didn't experience long stretches of lockdown. For the first 2 years, especially before Omicron was here, of course you go out with your masks, but we didn't live with the fear of COVID around in many of the cities and places across the country because Wuhan was very effectively controlled in a short amount of time, relatively speaking, remembering that at the time it was an unknown virus to the world. The rest of the world had actually time to deal with it, but then that's where we saw millions of deaths. And we didn't live with the daily fear of getting the disease, the virus, nor did we live with the fear of the tragedy of death and destruction around us that many countries left. So in many ways, I think over the last 3 years, there was a kind of guilt of having been able to move here. I was previously living in Brazil with my partner, and Brazil is the country with the second highest number of deaths next to the United States. And so there was a real sense of feeling that we went to a safer place where, the government was really taking COVID seriously when many of the governments had basically given up a long time ago.
And so why are we talking about this today? As we mentioned, for those of you who are watching this interview now, so me and Tings, we are both descendants of Chinese descendants. And so we both lived through the lockdowns, the strict COVID policies in China. And you probably heard from our voices that we are both recovering from COVID recently. I normally have a very high pitch voice. Now you probably hear this like a smoky voice because I'm on day 7 of being infected with COVID. But I'm getting better, so don't worry. I still have the energy to do this interview and do all my shows and things. She always have this sexy, smoky voice, but still, like she's also recovering from this recent infection with COVID. So
I think I'm
we
on day
lived
12
through
now.
day 12. Wow. So you still like even on day 12, you still have like cough from time to time. So there
Yeah,
are
not
some
too bad now. Just at nighttime, especially because Beijing is getting quite cold, so that's kind of hard on the lungs. But I would say
yeah.
I'm 95% there.
Mm-hmm. And Tings is from Hong Kong, and she grew up in Canada and also lives in South Africa and Brazil. And I'm born and raised in China. I've studied in the UK before, so we saw Chinese culture or China's policies or the Western culture from different perspectives. So I think today both of us will share how do we feel about this COVID restrictions in China? How do we value? How do we see China's work? And not just on COVID, but in the future we will talk about more. For example, the poverty alleviation projects. But today, since we all recovering from COVID, we will discuss the COVID policies, recent COVID situation in China. So you won't be misguided by this Western mainstream media. So, okay, first, I think I will ask you the first question. So, I think many people have mixed feelings about the past 3 years of the very strict COVID restrictions in China. And especially, I heard so many complaints is from expats. To be honest, from the beginning to now, and even during the lockdowns in Shanghai, the most complaints come from first aspects and also a lot of Chinese as well. But I'm just wondering, how do you see the China's way of dealing with this pandemic?
I mean, I think one of the things is like, first of all, this is a very complicated, complex, and deadly virus, especially when it's, hit the world. It started here in China at the end of 2019. There is no place in the world that hasn't been hit or had a really difficult time and where people have complained and had, terrible experiences. But I would say when we put China's experience in context of like a global context, it tells a different story. Because first of all, I think fundamentally why some of these measures were taken. Okay, you started with, I think, the episode talking about how, China sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't, whatever you do, it's going to be basically heavily attacked by Western mainstream media. But at the same time, this is a virus that was not known before. China is actually a pretty scientific country. It's not just going on feeling on how to approach this virus, but it's a huge amount of testing and experimenting and trying with the best intentions to contain the virus. And what is the main purpose? To save lives. And there's no doubt that, through whether it's, initially the heavy lockdown with Wuhan, and then there was probably at least about 10 cities that have gone through the mass lockdowns. But let's remember, that's not the actual entire country. Or experimenting with mass testing and really advancing the technology of how to test rapidly, to doing PCR testing in the daily life, to a variety of sort of, for example, health code tracking. There's been an experimentation. It's been changing for the last 3 years, responding to the virus that changes. So I think I have a great amount of respect in terms of the scientific approach to something that has never been experienced by humanity, And while many of the countries, I think, just threw in the towel early on, China maintained a zero COVID policy, not because of stubbornness or an intention to be draconian or repressive or anything like that, but ultimately it's to save lives. And we have to believe that because the numbers show it, the kind of time that China has been able to buy over the last 3 years have saved literally millions of lives. And in that meantime, China has been experimenting, developing new vaccines, increasing the vaccinations, especially of elders, building up the infrastructure, the medical infrastructure, knowing that China is still a developing country as much as it is the second largest economy. It still needs to develop, particularly the ICU beds that was very much lacking, the rural infrastructure, and that takes time. It's not something you do overnight. And I think we can go into a little bit more details of how it approached these aspects. But now we're seeing a difficult and complicated moment of transition to relaxing the rules. But it's because of these years of experimenting, buying time, and saving millions of lives in the process to get the population as prepared as it can be to face this strain of virus that is less deadly. And we know that now, and they've seen the statistics, they've done the studies, and they've done the modeling. And so it's, I think on this tail end of it, there's a kind of relief, I think, for me too, feeling like the last 3 years have been tough for everyone, for the whole world. But I'm glad to know that I was in a country that prioritized millions of lives over, say, the economy, over profit, over a variety of factors, even though collectively it was difficult.
Mm-hmm. And you know what? I think, especially in the past 1 or 2 years, we heard so many, either from Western media or people from different countries. They said, "Well, zero COVID is impossible to achieve," and there are some incidents of mismanagement at the local level, and they use that few cases to disqualify the whole measure, the whole China's zero COVID restrictions. But apparently they forgot what happened in 2020. So because zero COVID actually worked in China in 2020. Remember, in China, in the beginning of 2020, China put an unprecedented lockdown on such a big city and stopped millions of deaths, because now China still has the world's lowest death toll to the COVID-19, which is at 5,000, several hundred. So, and in later 2020, we literally had zero COVID cases. And that time, COVID was still very deadly. So you mentioned I went to Wuhan. Yes, like I went to Wuhan in 2020 during the lockdown as a reporter. So, and during that time, it was a scary time, honestly, because we went there and we were told, we don't know when can we bring you back, and we don't know when can we go back, because we just have to fight until the war is over. But no one knows at that time. No one knows when will this war be over. but with funneled over in later 2020, the virus was raging around the world, millions of deaths around the world. But China literally was the safest country in 2020. It was when the rest of the world gave up fighting with the COVID-19. And then we saw so many variants, and it become more and more transmissive, and then it snuck it back into China. So zero COVID was achievable. China achieved that, but the whole world, it wasn't a job that just can be done by one country, by one party, it's a collective work. If the whole world could do this, we could eliminate COVID-19 in 2020. We wouldn't see so many variants, Delta, Omicron, and so many variants, and that took so many lives. And also, even though it got weaker and weaker, but Delta was the variant that caused many post-COVID symptoms like long COVID. So it was still impact people pretty heavily. And and now because of Omicron is less deadly, and just people forgot the pain they had in 2020, COVID was that deadly back then. So lockdowns and strict COVID policies was very, very necessary. And Wuhan was a city with like 10 million residents. If we didn't stop it, and China has 1.4 billion people, if we didn't use the strict policies, just imagine how many people would die from this. So I would say zero COVID was achievable, and China achieved that. And strict policies was necessary, and China stopped millions of deaths. But it cannot be done just by if China is the only country doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that we're actually doing this conversation to think back over the 3 years, because especially I think in the media cycle, there's a kind of amnesia. It's very easy to just forget what even happened, 2 weeks ago, let alone 3 years ago, and remember the context, remember actually what the state of the world was, you know. The stories you're telling are, completely, shocking and saddening. And that's something that happened in the millions around the world. I mean, I think the last I checked, it was at something like 6.6 million people, each with, families who have that story that have been recorded. And that's until basically a lot of countries like stopped recording deaths related to COVID completely. So we don't actually know the cost, the human cost. And when you multiply that by millions, you get to remember, humanize that experience. So it's interesting because I think the example you used of how lots of media tends to look at some select examples of, mismanagement or confusion or complaints or unrest to be indicative of something of the whole country. But that, I think, is just oftentimes just bad journalism or with bad intentions at worst. So the thing is, even with this easing process, I mean, both of us will know many people, many friends who had worries, because they're remembering how deadly that virus is. There's a process of educating the public too, to say, hey, Omicron is not the same. It's okay. You can send your kids to school. It's okay that you can, go get vaccinated. But there's a lot of people, I mean, the parents, that when the easing started happening, the parents are like, oh, I'm not sending my kids to school. All of a sudden, there was a ton of students that had like foot pain, headache, tooth pain, don't go to school because, there's a sort of blanketing that Western media seems to do, that all Chinese people think the same. All of them want, have been sort of resisting the government controls, but actually it's not the case. It's a big country with 1.4 billion people. Each has an idea of what should happen. It's a huge management question as well, and we're still living through the transitional moment where, we have the official policy at the national level and how it gets implemented all the way down to the local levels. So yes, of course, there's sort of confusion. There's sort of different interpretations of how this will work or not. It's a huge country. This is also how all policies work. And we've seen with the last, especially in the last year with the different kinds of lockdowns in different cities, there's been implementation that's done differently. Some of them have been more successful. Some have not been, fighting the same virus. So that says a lot about sort of a decentralization that actually happens in the country that oftentimes I think gets conveniently masked. China is all one thing when Western media wants to say it is. Everyone's sort of sheep, follows the CPC and doesn't have any right to say. But then when there's any kind of difference, it's somehow questionable. So either way, I think the Chinese government doesn't win, but also the portrayal of Chinese people is equally, sort of damned if you do or don't. We're either human beings or we're not. All of a sudden, our lives matter when they didn't matter a few months ago. And for example, I remember now, because there's a lot of the Western media saying, oh, millions of people will die because China is relaxing its COVID measures. When a few months ago with the Shanghai lockdown, when I was there, I remember back in May, I think it was Nature Journal came out with one estimation that, judging from the numbers that they had at the time, vaccination rates, ICU beds, etc., there would be 1.5 million deaths in China if it just opened it right away. At that point, none of the Western media was talking about that. They were talking about how draconian it is, about human rights in Shanghai, about how people are suffering. And no one was talking about people who would die in that moment if it was just let go. Now, that seems to be conveniently the case when China is starting to open up. And now there's tons of articles talking about millions of people's deaths. So all of a sudden they care about us, but they don't look at the science about what's happened in the last 6 months. They don't look at the fact that vaccinations of elders, especially the 80 plus, which was the most vulnerable group, like a city like Shanghai has a quarter of its population above 60, has already maybe doubled its vaccination rates of that population. That the number of ICU beds have doubled since then. That the kind of scientific development around how to deal with Omicron has also developed in that time. China doesn't sort of stay in one place. Zero COVID has not just been one thing. It's been a kind of adaptation. So in a way, 6 months ago to now, the country is in a much better situation, learning from the kind of outbreaks before and what were the most sort of the biggest vulnerabilities. And so anyways, I think that's interesting because Chinese people aren't quite human. The Chinese state is repressive, and it's sometimes almost like a joke, because if you live here, you see a different reality.
Yeah. And now they suddenly care about our lives anymore, just like that. Yes, okay. Wasn't that just a month ago? You keep criticizing our COVID restrictions policies, and you really want all this go. And now you suddenly say, "Wow, this you are using that? That could cause millions of deaths." Oh, really? And by the way, your country already caused millions of deaths, and I didn't see you really care about that. You really care about the situation here, the country that has the lowest death toll to COVID till now. So it's very hypocritical. And also, some of the media, I think all this media, when they talk about the recent easing of COVID restrictions in China, they believe it's the result of the recent unrests, the recent protests in China. That's what caused China to ease its restrictions. But that's not true. If you look at the date that the government released the revising different rules, it's all before the so-called protest or unrest. For example, in the past 3 years, China didn't just adopt one policies or one COVID prevention and control protocols. In the past 3 years, China updated 9 different editions of COVID prevention control protocols. So 9 editions from early 2020 to 2022. They've been constantly updating the protocols to based on different variants, the different situations, and they've been sharing that with the doctors from around the world. And the 2 latest easing restrictions come from, for example, we call it 20条, the 20 clause, the 20 clauses of different changes which really get rid of the, for example, unnecessary mass testing, or shorten the quarantine time if you came from overseas. This 20 clause was released on November the 11th. That was announced from November the 11th, weeks before the so-called unrests. And if you see some people or kind of quarreling with their communities because they don't like the lockdowns, that's because they saw this instructions from the central government are not being carried out by the local communities. So they are arguing with their communities, hey guys, this government said you cannot do this, but you're doing this, so you're violating the restrictions. So now that's why they are arguing. They even call the police to come to here to supervise the situation. See, we are not fighting, there's no violence, we're just arguing with the local communities. Then they are not obeying the central government's new rules. So most of the so-called unrest are like this. People saw the local communities didn't follow the new restrictions. And the newest restrictions, the easing of restrictions was announced on December the 7th, which we call the 10 clause, which further easing more restrictions and allows home quarantines, eliminate more mass testings. So what I was trying to say is, all this, like, the government has been updating and changing its restrictions according to the situations, the change of the variants. And the easing of the restriction actually arrived long before the so-called unrests or protests. But the Western media will just say, see, that's the result of the protests. And I saw this, it's that New York Times article said, wow, China's U-turn. Now China has no plans. Now suddenly they worry about that China has no plans. New York Times was the one attacking China's COVID restrictions the most. Now when China easing its policies, now they said, whoa, China has no plans. Come on. So what do you want?
No, sometimes I feel like I think Western mainstream media is kind of out of creativity for the kinds of headlines that it needs to do, so the clickbait, right? Sometimes it's good for, I think, laughing material. Sometimes you'll see, a lot of comparisons on Twitter these days around, what the same journalist said 2 years ago and then what they say now, and all of a sudden it's like, which story are we going with about China being evil? Which one is more evil when they're doing, the opposite stuff? But I think it's important that you're raising that the easing measures had already been underway when the protests happened. I always think, it's interesting that when Western media, so mainstream media, decides to cover what kinds of protests, right? If you see kind of mass unrest, really popular unrest, they'll never make it to the front page of the New York Times. But somehow, relatively small groupings of protesters in China will get frontline attention. But I think there's something underneath this that I think is also part of the condescending way that Chinese people are viewed by this media, is that, we don't have any ways to criticize, raise complaints, or have avenues to be able to access or change or influence what happens around us, our lives, our policies. That's actually the big distortion, because, I think as you mentioned, there was discontent. The discontent weren't the small groupings of sort of upper middle class 20-somethings in some select cities. Yeah, there was confusion at the grassroots level, because actually people were emboldened by the central policy and using the central policy to exactly sort of confront sometimes the local bureaucrats that are using the excessive measures that are not following the government policy. It's actually not an anti-government thing. It's a pro-government thing to say, hey, I'm emboldened. This is what the central government said, and you're not implementing it right. And there's tons of that was circulating on social media. People, all those videos. That's in a normal society, in a moment of such big transition from a zero COVID policy to opening up is a complicated process, and you're going to have lots of issues. But that's not anti-government. So let's not confuse that with now it's a call for freedom. Now it's a call for President Xi Jinping to step down. It's that messaging we should have a lot of skepticism from, as something that represents the mass of Chinese people. But that being said, I think what was really interesting is also there was an article that was published by the Zhejiang Daily, shortly after some of this unrest was happening. And not probably coincidentally, that's the province where Xi Jinping used to be the governor. And there was it was an admonishment of the local bureaucrats not following the central government policy. It was a reminder, okay, don't use your sort of small-minded bureaucratic thinking, just laying down the law, when put human lives first. You have to listen to the people. You have to actually respond to what they need, not just because sometimes it's easier to just clamp down and close everything in a community rather than actually engage with how do you transition out of it. And I think that was actually quite assuring. It was actually the government or a government paper being very much on the side of the people who were upset about how some select communities were dealing with it. So when you actually look at it, it's a complete inversion from what the story that Western media might like to tell about how people are almost ready and up in arms to overthrow the government or the CPC. But that's just not the case. It just hasn't been the case. It's still a government that has one of the highest public supports of any so-called democratic country that gets to vote their leaders every 4 years. It is a place that has a lot of response from the upper levels down to the grassroots. And sometimes I wish, and maybe shows like this are important, that there are more ways and more curiosity and more interest for people to actually just find out, just get your basic information. I know it's hard right now, fighting between algorithms and censorship of the West, but that's kind of beholden to everyone to just get some information. And in a way, I think your channel is so essential because it came out in this moment, especially if you're reporting from Wuhan, and since then as being a important voice that can give a little bit of information, because the odds are against us to just be I don't know, just give facts, just facts.
Thank you. And you hear that, people. So like this video, click the like button, leave a comment, help us to break the algorithm. So so just stay updated with my videos, so our channels and also Tings work. Tings, how about you tell viewers where to find your work?
Sure. I mean, I think this is actually really related to our conversation, because just shortly after coming to China, a few people, researchers from all over the world interested in China, we got together and formed Dongsheng Collective, which is a group of researchers that basically gather and publish news about China. It's called dongshengnews.org. And this really was created in May 2020 because of what we were seeing in mainstream Western media, and that people who wanted to get some information about China, it was really hard to. So that's where the intention was. And now we've done a lot of work around China, Latin America, China, Africa, especially with a global South orientation, to understand, politics and society and culture here. So you can find that at all the online platforms at dongshengnews.org. And then you can also find me on Twitter. So you can search for Tings Chak and you'll find me.
Since all the media suddenly criticize, doubting China's new easing of COVID restrictions, so we can answer this question: why now? Why changing this policy now? I think first, because during one of the interviews I did with CGTN, I talked to a doctor, and he said the statistics from the recent outbreaks in China, in Guangzhou and in Shanghai, these two recent outbreaks in China really helped doctors here in China to gather the statistics whether the Omicron is deadly to people in China. So, and during those two recent outbreaks, they see, okay, it's not deadly. Most people are asymptomatic or with light symptoms recover soon. So that gives them enough scientific proof. So, okay, it's time to further easing the restrictions. And also, of course, after 3 years of strict policies, there are some discontent among people. Of course, everybody wants their life to get back to normal. And but we are doing this carefully. We cannot just sacrifice people's lives by chasing this freedom. So it's being carefully implemented. And I saw our opinion piece from someone who I think is just awful, but the headline just gave me a headache. He said, well, China doing this draconian policies for 3 years, and now China just ended up in the same place like with the West. So I was like, no, that's completely different. We didn't end up in the same place, okay? So China, now we're easing policies because of the virus. It's weaker and weaker and weaker. The 3 years wasn't in vain. We waited until the virus got weaker and weaker and weaker. So less life will be taken. But the West, most countries in the world basically just let the virus rip and took millions of lives. And now, so their freedom is based on the lives of millions around the world. But our freedom is based on protect millions of people from dying. So it's completely different. Yes, we are all easing. We all like back to normal. But the cost was completely different. So I think it's important to get this straight. Most people just like seeing this easing of restrictions, saying, so What was the purpose of doing these strict policies in the past 2 years? You ended up in the same place like, oh, yeah, like us. No, it's completely different. We were not in the same place.
I mean, I think this is a really important question you're asking about why now and why so long, and but I think you're there's probably 3 points, and the first is I totally agree with you. First is health. It's about buying time to save lives. There's no doubt about that. Not only is Omicron proven scientifically to be much less lethal, and that vast majority of cases here are asymptomatic, and there's much fewer serious cases and COVID-related deaths, and that's for sure. I mean, I think last week we had 7 reported deaths in Beijing linked to COVID officially, and then the second part is also around preparing the population. And even from 6 months ago, when I was making that comparison about vaccination rates during the Shanghai lockdown, and now huge advancements have been made and efforts to vaccinate the elderly. So as of this month, nearly 90% of people above 60 have now gotten their booster shots. This is a huge jump from just a few months ago. And that even waiting a few months makes a huge difference. And they had to do a lot of kind of changes in policy to allow that to happen. For example, approve more vaccine combinations, shorten the amount of time between shots, and a variety of things. That takes time to do. It's not overnight if you want to do it in a scientific way. And then, as I also mentioned, with the medical infrastructure is key. I was really surprised that at the beginning of COVID, looking and comparing the ICU beds, intensive care unit beds, to most Western capitalist developed countries, it's a huge difference. So back in 2020, usually it's counted by how many beds per 100,000 people. China had about 3.6 in 2020. That's about 7 times less than the US. But what's happened, knowing that that's a really kind of a weak spot in China's medical system, there's been huge efforts, particularly in the last few months, up that in preparation, I think, of this opening up period. So just in the last few months, China's doubled its capacity of ICU beds. Now there's about 10 per 100,000 people. That's a huge increase. It's still only a third of what the US has, but it's a huge increase. And that's with billions of dollars being spent to improve and create new facilities, or now they're turning those quarantine centers into some of these ICU beds, ensuring that at least 10% are ICU beds. That's a huge part. And next to that, you have to buy time to train workers. You can build the buildings, but you need the medical workers. So since 2019, there's been already increased efforts to train doctors, train nurses, and redirect some of those resources to these ICU rooms. That takes time as well to make a doctor in overnight. And then I think there's also an economic aspect. China has probably taken huge measures and huge hits to the economy and done relatively well as being a large economy that has been able to see positive growth. But it's been hit. Let's not pretend that it hasn't been. There are questions around employment, questions around, the real estate industry. There's a whole bunch of things that is difficult. And it was impressive that the government, for the first year, and I don't know how long, decided not to have a GDP growth expectation as we're ending up the year. And they just basically said to the country, try your best. That's a huge signal around putting people over the economy, putting people over profits. But doesn't mean that the economy is not suffering. So we'll just have to see what's also happening in this next phase, which will undoubtedly be part of the sort of economic response to 3 years of trying to contain a virus and having huge economic costs and huge government expenditure to be able to hold this virus at bay.
And I think in the next few days, few months, we'll see more easing of these policies. So let's see. But right now, I already see some similar conspiracy theories when they use the same conspiracy theories when it happened in Wuhan in 2020. For example, now since China is easing the restrictions, they start to say, for example, the crematorium has been working for 24 hours nonstop to burn the bodies. There's an increase of death. There's millions of death. And you know what? All these things with the same theories, same logic they used in Wuhan. In Wuhan, I heard the same theories. They said the crematoriums have been working nonstop, busy burning all the bodies. And I went to the crematoriums, and like, you know what? You cannot. This thing is it's something you cannot hide. If you really have millions of dead bodies, you will see that everywhere on the streets, and you will probably see footage of those things circling on the internet, but you don't see that. And that, especially disease like this, is something you can hide. And there are also, during a pandemic, there are increasing death of related to other disease, for example, cancer, AIDS, or so that will lead to increase of searching as well. Because of it's important that we realize why China is doing this strict policy in the past 3 years. One reason is that we need to protect, because of the limited medical resources we have, considering the scale of China and the large population. No matter how many medical resources we have, it's not enough for 1.4 billion people, especially we have a large old population who need it the most. So in the past 3 years, part of the reason was really to protect this group of people. And like you mentioned, to increase our ICU beds, increase our abilities to protect everyone when everything was eased. So the 3 years wasn't going in vain. We did a lot of work to improve, and but still, I just think it's funny that same theory. It's a deja vu. Where I read the stories, wait, why this story sounds so familiar?
At the time, there was, pictures of like mountains of cell phones. So that must be, proof of the millions dead, and videos from all kinds of places to show. But the thing is, I mean, I remember I had a chance to talk with Brian Becker, who's been on your show before, who's from Breakthrough News, or has a show on Breakthrough News. And he was remembering, being in New York City, the frozen refrigerator trucks just not even be able to contain all the bodies. I mean, that's the kind of thing you would see also in Brazil, where I was living before, where there was 700,000 people who died due to COVID. It's not something you can just hide. It's there, you see it and you feel it and you live it. But I think this is part of a long tradition of just sort of undermining or discrediting or calling, sort of just Chinese people and Chinese government liars. There's no numbers that can be credible. It's the same thing when we start talking about, the lifting of hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Somehow that is a number that has to be faked. Even when we have the, international institutions like the World Bank, which is not a progressive institution by the least, but then somehow still it's questionable. So I think it's a long process of always delegitimizing or attempting to delegitimize anything that has to do with the Chinese government or even Chinese people, I think. I think somehow there's a kind of racist attitude towards it that we're fundamentally not believed.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of those China watchers or China experts from Western countries, they're the same. So whenever they criticize China's policies or China's way of doing things, they will say, "Well, it's they will respond in a way that they looks like they care about Chinese people's freedom, liberty, but they are also the people that say the most racist things about Chinese people." So they only
exactly. If we're two people who are Chinese people talking about this, we're obviously, mouthpieces of the CPC, just paid to be mouthpieces of the CPC because we wouldn't have actual opinions of our own. But it's the people that, the same China watchers will want to save our lives and protect our freedom, for us. So I think that's always interesting.
And okay, since you mentioned this, because in the beginning, we talk about your experience. You grew up in different cultures. You were born in Hong Kong and also grew up in Canada, traveled to different continents. And I see the same question being asked by Westerners to people like you, because you are Chinese from Hong Kong, who grew up in the true democracy, experienced the true freedom, how come you still like China? How come you still think China's political system works? And you move back to China? This is so strange, Tings.
Yeah, really, right? I want to know what headline that you can come up with for that. I mean, I think it's a long process. I mean, I think as someone from Hong Kong, so families from Hong Kong and Macau, but also have family in Guangdong province. So the ties are still there, and sort of maintained, let's say. It takes a long time to sort of unlearn a colonial way of thinking. You know, let's not pretend, as much as I feel Chinese and I am Chinese, that 156 years of colonization doesn't have an impact on the thinking of the people. There was a detachment from the process of the Chinese Revolution. You know, the Communist Party of China does not formally exist in Hong Kong. There's no sort of that relationship of understanding what you know the party and the government has really done for its people. But on the contrary, then there's a lot of the sort of, let's say, bombardment from Western media. Let's not, you know, Hong Kong for many years was the heart of where, you know, the New York Times, Washington Post, or any kind of Western media will have their Asia desk headquartered there. So that's also that's the media. There's education, and it impacts the way of thinking. So long story short, I think for me, it was a big process of unlearning and coming to see for myself. You know, one of the big reasons and I think great fortunes I had to be able to come back in my adulthood was to see for myself and to learn, you know. I've had a chance to live in two different cities now in the mainland. I've gone down to Guangdong several times to visit my family. I've gone to the countryside in different provinces and been able to see some fundamental shifts. I think that even when the last time I spent a longer period in mainland, which was about 15 or 17 years ago now, really surprised me. And it was completely different from all the information, let's say, I had gotten from just being a diaspora Chinese or from Hong Kong or the Western media that I was consuming. It was completely different. And I'll use the main example that I think was a huge shift for me, not only in looking at how COVID was dealt with and the presence of a government that was trying to be responsible with the limitations it had, but taking lives seriously. But the other was really looking at the poverty alleviation campaign. Having a chance to go down, doing a research project with Tricontinental to Guizhou and actually seeing and talking to people and understanding what that abstract number of 800 million people lifted out of extreme poverty in the countryside means to women, to peasants, to young people in the countryside that now feel like they might have a future in the countryside, but also talking to the people who help mobilize that, you know, whether it's teachers that were sent there to work or party members that were sent there for years at a time, far away from their family. And this kind of thing, I guess, you know, you definitely can't see it on the news because they've just censored these kinds of stories. Quite literally, the US has censored one PBS documentary jointly done with CGTN by Robert Lawrence Kuhn about poverty alleviation. I never thought that poverty could be threatening, but apparently it is. So I think that was for me, this is a great moment to see sort of China in a different moment of its development. It still has a very long way to go. To see it also in the light of, I think, as there's intensifying sort of anti-China and xenophobic wave happening around the world. And I think we live in a scary time. The US is trying to provoke war in all, whether it's hot or cold war, in all its capacities. But now is the time, I think, we, you know, have a kind of almost duty to try to find out more, especially I think as Chinese people who have only gotten a very partial understanding about China, not having lived in mainland and having a sort of frozen idea of what China is without seeing how it kind of moves on and carries forward. And I think today's conversation about COVID is really indicative of how people see China, like this sort of fixed, uniform whole thing that doesn't move, doesn't learn, doesn't make mistakes, doesn't also learn from the mistakes. You know, this constant process that I think has built a country that is incredible to witness.
I think we still have a long way to go in this fight. We'll see more conspiracy theories. We'll see more demonization of China. So I will definitely have you back more often. So happy to have you today, and I hope to see you the next time.